Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. Before September 11, 2001, the aviation security system had been enjoying a period of relative peace. No U.S.-flagged aircraft had been bombed or hijacked in over a decade. Domestic hijacking in particular seemed like a thing of the past, something that could only happen to foreign airlines that were less well protected. The public's own threat assessment before September 11 was sanguine about commercial aviation safety and security. In a Fox News opinion dynamic survey conducted at the end of the 1990s, 78% cited poor maintenance as a greater threat to airline safety than terrorism. Demand for air service was strong and was beginning to exceed the capacity of the system. Heeding constituents' calls for improved air service and increased capacity, Congress focused its legislative and oversight attention on measures to address these problems, including a passenger Bill of Rights, to assure a more efficient and convenient passenger experience. The leadership of the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, also focused on safety, customer service, capacity, and economic issues. The agency's security agenda was focused on efforts to implement a 3-year-old congressional mandate to deploy explosives detection equipment at all major airports and complete a nearly 5-year-old rulemaking effort to improve checkpoint screening. This staff statement will not address certain security performance issues leading up to 9/11 at the airports from which the hijackers' planes departed. Such work is still ongoing. It should be noted that the airports themselves did not have operational or enforcement jurisdiction over checkpoint screening operations. Passenger pre-screening and checkpoint screening, based on regulations from the FAA, were the responsibility of the air carriers. Nevertheless, airport authorities do play a key role in the overall civil aviation security system. Before September 11th, federal law required the FAA to set and enforce aviation security policies and regulations that would, quote, protect passengers and property on an aircraft operating in air transportation or intrastate air transportation against an act of criminal violence or aircraft piracy. This layered system, one that recognized that no single security measure was flawless or impenetrable, was designed to provide a greater number of opportunities to foil those intending to do such violence. The civil aviation security system in place on September 11th was composed of 7 layers of defense, including intelligence, passenger pre-screening, airport access control, passenger checkpoint screening, passenger checked baggage screening, cargo screening, and onboard security. The civil aviation security system in place on September 11th no longer exists. We will document serious shortcomings in that system's design and implementation that made the 9/11 hijackings possible. We want to make clear that our findings of specific vulnerabilities and shortcomings do not necessarily apply to the current system. 2 of the layers of defense, checked baggage screening and cargo screening, are not relevant to the 9/11 plot. They are not addressed in this statement. A 3rd layer, airport access control, is still under investigation and also will not be addressed in detail here. Compelling evidence, including videotape of hijackers entering through checkpoint screening stations, suggests that the hijackers gained access to the aircraft on September 11th through passenger checkpoints. What we do know is that the hijackers successfully evaded or defeated the remaining 4 layers of the security system. We approached the question of how the aviation security system failed on September 11th by starting from the perspective of the enemy, asking, what did Al-Qaeda have to do to complete its mission? Sometime during the late 1990s, the Al-Qaeda leadership made the decision to hijack large commercial multi-engine aircraft and use them as a devastating weapon, as opposed to hijacking a commercial aircraft for use as a bargaining tool. To carry out that decision would require unique skill sets. Among them, terrorists trained as pilots with specialized skill and confidence to successfully fly large multi-engine aircraft already airborne into selected targets. Tactics, techniques, and procedures to successfully conduct in-flight hijacking. And 3, operatives willing to die. To our knowledge, 9/11 was the first time in history that terrorists actually piloted a commercial jetliner in a terrorist operation. This was new. This could not happen overnight and would require long-term planning and sequenced operational training. The terrorists had to determine the tactics and techniques needed to succeed in hijacking an aircraft within the United States. The vulnerabilities of the U.S. domestic commercial aviation security system were well advertised through numerous unclassified reports from agencies such as the General Accounting Office and the Department of Transportation's Inspector General. The news media had publicized those findings. The al-Qaeda leadership recognized the need for more specific information, though. Its agents observed the system firsthand and conducted surveillance flights both internationally and within the United States. Over time, this information allowed them to revise and refine their operational plan. By the spring of 2001, the September 11 operation had combined intent with capabilities to present a real and present threat to the civil aviation system. As long as operational security was maintained, the plan had a high probability of success in conducting multiple near-simultaneous attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. Let us now turn to a more specific look at the security system in place on September 11 related to anti-hijacking. We'll begin with intelligence. The first layer of defense in aviation security was intelligence. While the FAA was not a member of the U.S. Intelligence Committee per se, the agency maintained a Civil Aviation Intelligence Division that operated 24 hours per day. The Intelligence Watch was the collection point for a flow of threat-related information from federal agencies, particularly the FBI, CIA, and State Department. FAA intelligence personnel were assigned as liaisons to work within these three agencies to facilitate the flow of aviation-related information to the FAA and to promote interdepartmental cooperation. The FAA did not assign liaisons to either the National Security Agency or the Defense Intelligence Agency, but maintained intelligence requirements with those agencies. Intelligence data received by the FAA went into preparing intelligence case files. These files tracked and assessed the significance of aviation security incidents, threats, and emerging issues. The FAA's analysis of this data informed its security policies, including the issuance of FAA information circulars, security directives, and emergency amendments to the industry. Such security directives and emergency amendments are how the FAA ordered air carriers and/or airports to undertake certain extraordinary security measures that were needed immediately above the established baseline. While the staff has not completed its review and analysis as to what the FAA knew about the threat posed by al-Qaeda to civil aviation, including the potential use of aircraft as weapons, we can say the following. First, no documentary evidence reviewed by the Commission or testimony we have received to this point has revealed that any level of the FAA possessed any credible and specific intelligence indicating that Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda affiliates, or any other group were actually plotting to hijack commercial planes in the United States and use them as weapons of mass destruction. Second, the threat posed by Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda affiliates, including their interest in civil aviation, was well known to key civil aviation security officials. The potential threat of Middle Eastern terrorist groups to civil aviation security was acknowledged in many different official FAA documents. The FAA possessed information claiming that associates with Osama bin Laden in the 1990s were interested in hijackings and the use of an aircraft as a weapon. Third, the potential for terrorist suicide hijacking in the United States was officially considered by the FAA's Office of Civil Aviation Security, dating back to at least March 1998. However, in a presentation the agency made to air carriers and airports in 2000 and early 2001, the FAA discounted that threat because, quote, fortunately, we have no indication that any group is currently thinking in that direction. It wasn't until well after the 9/11 attacks that the FAA learned of the Phoenix EC. This was an internal FBI memo written in July of 2001 by an FBI agent in the Phoenix field office, suggesting steps that should be taken by the Bureau to look more closely at civil aviation education schools around the country and the use of such programs by individuals who may be affiliated with terrorist organizations. Fourth, the FAA was aware prior to September 11, 2001, of the arrest of Zacharias Moussaoui in Minnesota, a man arrested by the INS in August of 2001 following reports of suspicious behavior in flight school and the determination that he had overstayed his visa waiver period. Several key issues remain regarding what the FAA knew about Moussaoui, when they knew it, and how they responded to the information supplied by the FBI, which we are continuing to pursue. Fifth, the FAA did react to the heightened security threat identified by the intelligence community during the summer of 2001 including issuing alerts to air carriers about the potential for terrorist acts against civil aviation. In July 2001, the FAA alerted the aviation community to reports of possible near-term terrorist operation, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula and/or Israel. The FAA informed the airports and air carriers that it had no credible evidence of specific plans to attack U.S. civil aviation. The agency said that some of the currently active groups were known to plan and train for hijackings and had the capability to construct sophisticated, improvised explosive devices concealed inside luggage and consumer products. The FAA encouraged all U.S. carriers to exercise prudence and demonstrate a high degree of alertness. Although civil aviation security officials testified that the FAA felt blind when it came to assessing the domestic threat because of the lack of intelligence on what was going on in the American homeland as opposed to overseas, FAA security analysts did perceive an increasing terrorist threat to the U.S. civil aviation system at home. FAA documents, including agency accounts published in the Federal Register on July 17, 2001, expressed the FAA's understanding that terrorist groups were active in the United States and maintained an historic interest in targeting aviation, including hijacking. While the agency was engaged in an effort to pass important new regulations to improve checkpoint screener performance, implement anti-sabotage measures, and conduct ongoing assessments of the system, no major increases in anti-hijacking security measures were implemented in response to the heightened threat levels in the spring and summer of 2001, other than general warnings to the industry to be more vigilant and cautious. Sixth, the civil aviation security system in the United States during the summer of 2001 stood, as it had for quite some time, at an intermediate aviation security alert level, tantamount to a permanent code yellow. This level and its corresponding security measures was required when information indicates that a terrorist group or other hostile entity with a known capability of attacking civil aviation is likely to carry out attacks against U.S. targets, or civil disturbances with a direct impact on civil aviation have begun or are imminent. Without actionable intelligence information to uncover and interdict a terrorist plot in the planning stages, or prior to the perpetrator gaining access to the aircraft in the lead-up to September 11, 2001, it was up to the other layers of aviation security to counter the threat. We conclude this section with a final observation. The last major terrorist attack on a U.S.-flagged airliner had been with smuggled explosives in 1988 in the case of Pan Am 103. The famous Bojinka plot, broken up in Manila in 1995, had principally been a plot to smuggle explosives on airliners. The Commission on Aviation Safety and Security, created by President Clinton in 1996, named the Gore Commission for its chairman, the Vice President, had focused overwhelmingly on the danger of explosives on aircraft. Historically, explosives on aircraft had taken a heavy death toll. Hijackings had not. So despite continued foreign hijackings leading up to 9/11, the U.S. aviation security system worried most about explosives. After intelligence, the next level is pre-screening. If intelligence fails to interdict the terrorist threat, passenger pre-screening is the next layer of defense. Passenger pre-screening encompasses measures applied prior to the passenger's arrival at the security checkpoint. Pre-screening starts with the ticketing process and generally concluded with passenger check-in at the airport ticket counter. The hijackers purchased their tickets for the 9/11 flights in a short period of time at the end of August 2001 using credit cards, debit cards, or cash. The ticket record provided the FAA and the air carrier with passenger information for the pre-screening process. The first major pre-screening element in place on 9/11 was the FAA listing of individuals known to pose a threat to commercial aviation. Based on information provided by the intelligence community, the FAA required air carriers to prohibit listed individuals from boarding aircraft or in designated cases to assure that the passenger received enhanced screening before boarding. None of the names of the 9/11 hijackers were identified by the FAA to the airlines in order to bar them from flying or subject them to extra security measures. In fact, the number of individuals subject to such security instructions issued by the FAA was less than 20 people, compared to the tens of thousands of names identified in the State Department's tip-off watch list, which the Commission discussed yesterday. The second component of pre-screening was a program to identify those passengers on each flight who may pose a threat to aviation. In 1998, the FAA required air carriers to implement an FAA-approved computer-assisted passenger pre-screening program, known as CAPS, designed to identify the pool of passengers most likely in need of additional security scrutiny. The program employed customized FAA-approved criteria derived from a limited set of information about each ticketed passenger in order to identify selectees. FAA rules require that the air carrier only screen each selectee's checked baggage for explosives using various approved methods. However, under the system in place on 9/11, selectees, those who were regarded as a risk to the aircraft, were not required to undergo any additional screening of their person or carry-on baggage at the checkpoint. The consequences of selection reflected FAA's view that non-suicide bombing was the most substantial risk to domestic aircraft. Since the system in place on 9/11 confined the consequences of selection to the screening of checked bags for explosives, the application of CAPS did not provide any defense against the weapons and tactics employed by the 9/11 hijackers. On American Airlines Flight 11, CAPS chose 3 of the 5 hijackers as selectees. Since Waleed al-Shari checked no bags, his selection had no consequences. Wael al-Shari and Satam al-Sakami had their checked bags scanned for explosives before they were loaded onto the plane. None of the Flight 175 hijackers were selected by CAPS. All 5 of the American Airlines Flight 77 hijackers were selected for security scrutiny. Hani Hanjour, Khalid al-Midhar, and Majed Moked were chosen via the CAPS criteria, while Nawaf al-Hazmi and Salem al-Hazmi were made selectees because they provided inadequate identification information. Their bags were held until it was confirmed that they had boarded the aircraft. Thus, for hijacker selectees Hani Hanjour, Nawaf al-Hazmi, and Khalid al-Midhar, who checked no bags on September 11th, there were no consequences for their selection by the CAPS system. For Salem al-Hazmi, who checked 2 bags, and Majed Moked, who checked 1 bag, the sole consequence was that their baggage was held until after their boarding on Flight 77 was confirmed. Ahmed al-Haznawi was the sole CAPS selectee among the Flight 93 hijacker. He checked his bag, was screened for explosives, and then loaded the plane. I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague, Bill Johnstone.